Welcome to the Veritas podcast, the weekly show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church. Hello, welcome. I'm Robert Kassman. He's Robert Sisko, and this is the Veritas podcast. We are working on Pascendi. We're about to start it. Previously, in the last episode, we gave a brief overview. Rob connected the dots between Libertas, the encyclical from Leo XIII, and Pascendi, and he laid the groundwork for that by talking about how liberalism and naturalism are kind of the roots that germinate and help modernism come to be what it is. We kind of looked at some of the errors that we're going to be talking about and the philosophy of it, the goal of modernists specifically. So in this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about modernism some more in general, Pascendi in general, and we'll get into paragraphs 1 and 2 hopefully. So we'll go on and get started on that. In paragraph 1, Pius writes, quote, "One of the primary obligations assigned by Christ to the office divinely committed to us of feeding the Lord's flock is that of guarding with the greatest vigilance the deposit of the faith delivered to the saints, rejecting the profane novelties of words and the gainsaying of knowledge falsely so called." End of quote. The fact that so many, Rob, have lost the faith or do not know it is proof that our shepherds have not protected the flock or the deposit of faith. In the book Feeding the Lord's Flock, the author writes that it is the duty of priests to expose and explain those things and people who can harm the faith. Now, how often do we see this happen? I've almost never seen errors exposed. Pius writes, quote, "Unless the kindness that in the hope of the wiser counsels we have hitherto shown them should be set down to lack of diligence in the discharge of our office." End of quote. The Pope here is saying that kindness has not worked. A lot of people say we need to be more kind. They might tell you, Rob, or me that we're too mean, or that we speak of all the negative stuff in the world, or we're too filled with anger and negativity. But Pius is talking about that. Kindness does not bring about the salvation of souls. And the proof is in the success of the modernists. What do you think?
Yeah, now kindness is a good quality, and it does help a lot of times to draw people in. But what he's saying here is that he originally tried to win over the modernists with kindness because again, that is a good thing to do. You start with kindness, he said, but it didn't work. It didn't work trying to be kind to these modernists, and I have experienced the exact same thing myself. You come across these people who are hardened in the errors of either modernism or liberalism, and I've tried every approach in the Bible. I've tried the kind approach. I've tried every approach, and the kind approach, in my experience, it actually had the opposite effect. It usually actually emboldens them when you're kind of kind in the face of their errors. It's strange. It's strange that it has that effect. It usually doesn't. Usually kindness has a good effect. And again, kindness is a good disposition to have. It's a good approach. But with modernists and with liberals, it has the opposite effect. Now, one more point is that kindness has the opposite effect generally on these people who are hardened in these errors. But we should probably assume when we're first dealing with someone that's infected with these that they're not hardened in the errors. Because the times that we live in, they're so confusing, there's so much confusion out there, it's best to assume the person is innocently in error. And so in that case, it would be best to be kind to them at first. But you'll find, I think, as I've done, that when they're hardened, they know what the church teaches, but they're just hardened in their errors, kindness backfires. And that's what Pius intends to do. Same thing with him 100 years ago. It backfired with him as well.
Yeah, and we see that in this encyclical, Pius comes pretty strong, crashing down on these heresies. But you make an excellent point, Rob, also about the approach with people. And this is a lesson I need to learn as well. But sometimes you can have kindness and find out that these people don't really know they're modernists. They're not really doing it intentionally. This is just how they've always lived, and this is what they thought they always knew. And we're going to talk about this in a minute, that they thought this is what their Pastor Joe wanted them to be like. But at the same time, I've noticed people can be hardened in their ignorance. So they will state what they think is church doctrine on something. And when they're corrected with kindness, they become much more aggressive because they think that you're being a know-it-all and you're telling them that they're wrong. So a lot of times, kindness does not work because, like you said, it emboldens them to kind of be on the offensive.
Yeah, that's exactly what I've experienced. I was actually kind of shocked the first time I experienced that, and then the more I experienced it, I was kind of surprised. But yeah, it has that effect. It actually emboldens them the kinder you are. But I've noticed the opposite too. When I kind of rose up and I kind of defended the faith strongly, when I don't like getting in people's face necessarily, but sometimes it happens, and I've noticed they're all of a sudden become deer in the headlights, and they kind of back down. Again, not that we want to go around yelling at people or being like that, but sometimes, in this world, it's difficult, and sometimes that does happen. And again, like I said, when it's happened with me several times, the people have usually backed down, and they're sitting like a deer in the headlights. So.
Now, I mentioned earlier about commenting on what Pius wrote about the shepherds not guarding the flock, and I think that'd be a fair thing for somebody to question. That there's a mountain, though, of evidence of the shepherd's flock not being fed correctly. Without shepherds, however, the flock will be open to attack by the wolves. So I'm going to give out some numbers. I don't want it to be lost, so I'll try to go slowly. Since the end of 1965, the number of priests has fallen by more than 45,000. This is evident in ordinations, where the amount has dropped from nearly 1,600 in 1965 to less than 450 now. And all these numbers I'm saying are cited, and anybody can look it up. Leading indicators of Catholic life, that's a really good one just to Google that. We see almost daily parishes closing. We hear about them all the time. And this is due to the priest shortage and some other issues as well. The amount of seminarians has dropped by more than 90%. Sisters have dropped by more than 94%. 94%. The amount of Catholic students has fallen by about half. And all this has resulted in a negative effect on Catholic life. For instance, annulments are up from 338 to more than 50,000 in the past 50 years or so. 50,000. Only 20% of Catholics claim to attend Mass weekly, and I think about 30-something% never attend Mass. 82% believe that contraception is morally okay. 45% of Catholics do not even know the Church's teaching on the real presence. What do you think about those numbers, Rob?
Well, what I think is people are not being taught the faith. A few things I was thinking of when you were talking about that. One is, we all hear stories of people who, like John Vanari, he said he went to 12 years of Catholic boys' school and said he never heard mortal sin. He never heard the idea of mortal sin. And I was in the airplane with a lady a couple weeks ago. She was returning. She's a Baptist, I think, now. She's returning from some kind of missionary trip to Cuba. I got talking to her, and she was a fallen away Catholic, and so I want to try to talk to her, ask her if there's any issues that she had that caused her to leave the church. And I was going to try to help her clear things up. And she told me she didn't learn any doctrines in the Catholic Church. She didn't learn anything in the Catholic Church. But I'm comparing that with my father-in-law. My father-in-law, who grew up in the 50s, he's been away from the church now for many decades, 30 years or 40 years, and I can guarantee you he wasn't a pious boy when he was in Catholic school. But even so, you can tell when you talk to him, he has a sense of the faith. The faith was drilled into him by those nuns, and even though he probably wasn't paying a lot of attention and has been away from the church for all these decades, still you talk to him and he has things right, but it's not just he has them right. He has a sense of the faith. He has a sense of the supernatural truths and things that was drilled into him. So the problem is people have not been taught the faith since Vatican II, and that's a big part of the problem. And that's why also they fall for all these modern errors, because they don't know any better.
I think you're absolutely right. It's pretty sad. Okay, paragraph 2 of Pascendi. I'm just going to read this all the way through, and then we'll do our comments. Quote, That we should act without delay in this matter is made imperative, especially by the fact that the partisans of error are to be sought not only among the Church's open enemies, but, what is to be most dreaded and deplored, in her very bosom, and are the more mischievous the less they keep in the open. We allude, venerable brethren, to many who belong to the Catholic laity, and, what is much more said, to the ranks of the priesthood itself, who, animated by a false zeal for the Church, lacking the solid safeguards of philosophy and theology, nay, more, thoroughly imbued with the poisonous doctrines taught by the enemies of the Church, and lost to all sense of modesty, put themselves forward as reformers of the Church, and forming more boldly into line of attack, assail all that is most sacred in the work of Christ, not sparing even the person of the divine Redeemer, whom, with sacrilegious audacity, they degrade to the condition of a simple and ordinary man. End of quote. Now, we'll try to take our time, Rob, when going through this, because Pius, he's one of my favorites for a reason, does an excellent job, and he says it exactly how it was, which is said in 1907. And it's only gotten worse. We've talked about this over and over again.
Yeah, notice 100 years ago, you already had these modernist priests who were infected with his error, and then when Pius X condemned it here in Pascendi, he didn't just condemn it in this encyclical. He actually had teeth to his actions, and he drove out the modernists, removed them from the seminaries, and that suppressed modernism for a time. It was still there, but it was kept under the surface, still kind of growing, but under the surface. And then it flourished again here in Vatican II. But notice, over 100 years ago, listen to what he's saying. Already at that time, priests were infected with these errors.
Yeah, and he speaks about, he gives a couple of examples, or at least a couple of reasons maybe already, false zeal for the Church and lacking the solid safeguards of philosophy and theology. And so how many priests nowadays know even Latin, know a good theology handbook when they see one? How many times do you speak to a priest and you feel like you know more about theology or philosophy than he does? And this doesn't mean that he himself is bad or whatever, but he's ignorant due to the poor teaching, the poor catechesis of the priests.
Yeah, in Pius X, the end of the encyclical, he says that the antidote for modernism is the metaphysics, the philosophy of St. Thomas. And that's what we're going to do as in our study here. We're going to use the philosophy, the metaphysics of St. Thomas to expose these errors. Because in Pascendi, if there could be one negative about the encyclical in our day, is that he exposes the errors great, but he's talking to people who know the faith, and so he doesn't say the truth as opposed to the error. For the most part, he just condemns the error, assuming everyone's going to know the truth. But today, people don't know the truth. So what we'll do is we'll try to also show the truth against the error and use the metaphysics of St. Thomas to try to sort everything out. So, yeah, he says later on that the philosophy and also theology of St. Thomas is the antidote to modernism. And he also says if you see someone who starts to dislike Thomistic theology and metaphysics, that's one of the first signs they're drifting into modernism.
We've talked about this so much, though, Rob. Some speak about the enemies of the Church as if they're outside, but Pius here in this paragraph writes about how these priests are wreaking havoc from within. And folks like myself see this every day with cardinals and bishops at the infamous clown masses and just insanity all the way from 1960s on up. Pius writes, quote, "And all lost to all sense of modesty put themselves forward as reformers of the Church, and forming more boldly into a line of attack, assail all that is most sacred in the work of Christ." He continues, "Not sparing even the person of the divine Redeemer, whom, with sacrilegious audacity, they degrade the condition of a simple and ordinary man." End of quote. Were the architects not of Vatican II reformers? They reformed everything, Rob. 7 sacraments, new catechism, canon law, new mass, on and on and on. And as the nature of modernists, they can't help but to continue to reform, as they say. Regular revisions of the Mass come out almost yearly. Smashing of the rules of washing only males' feet, redefining Martin Luther as no longer a heretic, changing the rosary, doing away with the idea of limbo, and on and on and on.
Yeah, see, everything for modernists, everything has to change because for them, remember we said, change is a sign of life and a sign of truth. Remember, they believe that man is evolving. And since change is a sign of evolution because there's something evolved, changing, since change is a sign of evolution, religion itself must change if it's to keep up with man who's evolving into a higher consciousness. Remember, revelation and consciousness are synonymous. That's what Pius X said. Revelation and consciousness are synonymous. So if they believe man is evolving to a higher consciousness, then his revelation is evolving, so everything has to change to keep up. So religion, which they say springs forth from man's heart, and truth comes from man's consciousness, well, they have to evolve. They have to change to keep up with man who's evolving and changing into God. So everything comes from within man. It changes and evolves with man, so the past has to be abandoned, and we have to embrace novelty, newness, and change. And this also explains why the modernists in the hierarchy will show great respect for someone like Hans Kung. And Hans Kung rejects basically everything. He openly rejects. He's written books. He rejects everything. But they show great tolerance for him. They would probably consider, if you think about how modernists think, they would probably consider Hans Kung just to be a little ahead of his time. You know, Hans Kung just might be a little farther advanced, a little farther evolved than us, a visionary, so to speak. While at the same time, these same members of the hierarchy will react with disgust towards traditional Catholics who refuse to abandon the perennial teachings of the Church and the dogmatic decrees of the Council and change. So the traditionalists, they hold to what was believed before. Modernists don't like that. Hans Kung, he rejects everything of the past. Well, him, maybe he's just a little ahead of the time. We're going to try to treat him with kid gloves. He's going to still be able to have his teaching post. See? And this also explains why a modernist would then shy away from the idea of objective, immutable truth, okay, and from holding too firmly to any dogma, okay, lest in so doing he risked the danger of not progressing to the next evolutionary phase of higher consciousness.
Okay, moving on to paragraph 3. It reads, quote, "Although they express their astonishment that we should number them amongst the enemies of the Church, no one will be reasonably surprised that we should do so if, leaving out of account the internal disposition of the soul, of which God alone is the judge, he considers their tenets, their manner of speech, and their action. Nor indeed would he be wrong in regarding them as the most pernicious of all the adversaries of the Church. For, as we have said, they put into operation their designs for her undoing, not from without, but from within. Hence, the danger is present almost in the very veins and heart of the Church, whose injury is the most certain from the very fact that their knowledge of her is more intimate. Moreover, they lay the axe, not to the branches and shoots, but to the very root, that is, to the faith in its deepest fibers. And once having struck at this root of immortality, they proceed to diffuse poison through the whole tree, so that there is no part of Catholic truth which they leave untouched, none that they do not strive to corrupt." End of quote.
Yeah, also, the next sentence he says this, "Further, none is more skillful, none more astute than they, in the employment of 1,000 noxious devices. For they play the double part of rationalist and Catholic, and this so craftily that they easily lead the unwary into error. And as audacity is their chief characteristic, there is no conclusion of any kind from which they shrink, or which they do not thrust forward with pertinacity and assurance. So notice what he said here. He describes them as the most pernicious of all the adversaries of the church. He describes them as being extremely crafty and deceptive. And he also says audacity is their chief characteristic. And I've noticed that. You read some of their books, and they blatantly reject dogmas of the faith. One I'm going to mention later in the encyclical, and I'll mention who said this, but he openly denies the resurrection of the body. This is the person that most Catholics would consider a conservative. The press presents him as an arch-conservative. Remember in Veritas we mentioned Cardinal Pell, who denied the existence of Adam and Eve. He's also presented as a conservative. Well, the one I'm going to quote, he's also presented as a hardcore conservative, but he openly denies in a book the resurrection of the body. It's in print right now. He openly denies it, and no one talks about it. What he says is the resurrection of the body, what it really means, it means the resurrection of the person. It doesn't mean the resurrection of the actual physical body.
Right. Yep.
And then he goes on to kind of ridicule the theologians in the church and catechisms, which taught the resurrection of the body and taught the characteristics that the resurrected body will have. But this particular person is looked at as this, hardcore arch-conservative, when in reality, he's a modernist who had the audacity to deny the resurrection of the body in a book. The book was written in 1968. It's still in print. It has a new foreword by the author written in 2000, and it's in print right now by Ignatius Press. But we'll get into that, and I'll mention who that is in a future episode.
And we mentioned Hans Kung earlier. It might be important to note he's a Swiss Catholic priest, theologian, author, a teacher. He wrote a book in the 70s. We're talking about audacity. These modernists always have audacity. They like to make a big splash, and they're always looked at as ahead of their time because they don't fit with what they're supposed to be saying. But he openly questions infallibility of the Pope. I think that's what the book is called, something like Infallibility Questions, something to that effect. I apologize for not knowing, but just like the one that Rob's alluding to that we'll look into later, these modernists are almost blatantly open about it, and that's what's so audacious about it. But because they're priests and they're supposed to be trusted, they're much more dangerous. They're like the devil looking to devour somebody.
Right. Now, concluding here, these first two episodes, these were more of a general overview of modernism itself. In the following episodes, we're going to get into the specifics. But we thought of these first two, it'd be a good idea just to give a broad, general overview before we get into the fine details of modernism.
Now, if any listeners, again, like I said before, would like to give us comments or feedback or suggestions for future series, we welcome it. veritaspodcast@yahoo.com. As I said before, we can be found on veritaspodcast.blogspot.com. Rob, it's been a pleasure again.
Okay, look forward to next time.